My name is Rachel McDonough, and this is my friend. Hi, I'm Susanna, and we're here at the beautiful Madison Square Garden for the big fight, and you are watching True School Sports.
I know it's one fighter that cussed him out. I told Mike to never fight, and that was George Foreman. He was just too big, he was too strong.
Hey, what's going on? It's your boy BT, and I came here to talk some boxing with the thousands of True School Sports subscribers. Now, a little bit of boxing history talk here. We're going to talk about Mike Tyson. We're going to talk about George Foreman. It was a big fight that was a huge possibility in the early 90s. It was a fight that could have been made, and it never happened. And I know there's been videos on YouTube about this fight that never happened. And I'm gonna do my own version of it because I've had a chance to interview a lot of people who either fought Mike Tyson and George Foreman or trained Mike Tyson or knew George Foreman. So I have my own little video clips you guys will be seeing later on in the video, as you guys just saw with Stacey McKinley in the beginning of the video. Big shouts out to Stacey McKinley. And as you guys saw, you know, Stacey told you that Mike Tyson himself told Stacey while Stacey was training him, you know, in the mid-90s, that Mike Tyson told him that Customato told Mike Tyson to stay away from George Foreman at all costs, and that he could never beat George Foreman because George Foreman, Mike Tyson's style, being a swarmer, being a guy who liked to crowd you on the inside, he was made to order for George Foreman the same way Joe Frazier was made to order for George Foreman, and George Foreman, when he was in his prime, stopped Joe Frazier. So the fact that Customato, who Mike valued his words on boxing and pretty much anything in life very much, the fact that Cus told him to not fight George Foreman, that stayed with him, and it never happened. And around, you know, following Mike Tyson's loss to Buster Douglas in February of 1990 in Tokyo, Japan, like I said, Don King was looking to get him back on the fast tracks towards heavyweight success. And it was at this time where, you know, Evander Holyfield, or I should say, it was around this time where they were trying to make the fight happen. And it was actually announced, believe it or not, in late April of 1990 that Foreman and Tyson, they would be broadcast on HBO together in a co-feature. And, you know, Foreman was going to fight Adelson Rodriguez. Tyson was going to fight the unranked Henry Tillman. And they were both going to be on the same card, and that was going to be their way of building the fight up. But never quite happened. Never quite happened. You know, Tyson didn't want to fight Foreman, and pretty much there's actually an article, and it's common knowledge, it's public information, you guys can go find it for yourself, but if you go type in like Mike Tyson ducking George Foreman, and you can go to the link in the description that I have for you guys, you'll see for yourself, like, pretty much this one writer who I guess knew the fighters or knew the managers. He knew George Benton, he knew Lou Duva, he knew Bobby Goodman, just people that were in the know. That and Goodman was Don King's matchmaker, for you guys that don't know. Bobby Goodman was Don King's matchmaker, and pretty much this guy had asked Bobby Goodman, you know, what's up with the Tyson Foreman fight? Why wouldn't it happen? And they were basically just like, you know, Bobby was like, he basically said, what's up with Foreman? Aren't they supposed to be fighting each other on the 16th? And then he basically said that Mike Tyson was scared shitless of George Foreman, and you guys can go read that in the article. And basically just goes on to talk about how Mike wasn't going to fight him, and he didn't want to fight him, and pretty much Mike Tyson had told Don King that he's not an effing animal, and that he's not going to fight George Foreman under any circumstances, because he himself knew he didn't believe Mike Tyson at 23 or 24 years old, how old he was in 1990, didn't believe what many of the masses believed. They didn't believe that George Foreman was this easy opponent with a great name. He knew that George Foreman was a great fighter, still a great fighter, a dangerous fighter, and he had, remember the words of Cus years ago, to that style was wrong for Tyson, and he was made to order. So he wasn't gonna fight George Foreman. But this video right here is going to be just a little documentary, just to get a little bit of insight on what happened between the two, and just how great each of these fighters were. And then at the end of the video, I'll give you guys a little assessment of the fight. So yeah, to go learn more about that situation, because I don't want to ramble too long, the link will be in the description. Mike pretty much told Don King's matchmaker that he's not fighting George Foreman under any circumstances. So what you guys are going to see right now in this part of the video is you're gonna see Stacey McKinley talking about Mike Tyson, you know, when he worked with him, just how great of a fighter he was, and pretty much just like what he learned from training him, and just the level of greatness that he got to watch every day in the ring with Mike. And then we'll come back and I'll talk to you guys here in a little bit.
And you know, you're a trainer who's been around the block. Like you've been in boxing for longer than I've been alive. So one thing I wanted to kind of ask you is like you were around Mike Tyson, you know, back in the day. What's your like? Do you have a Mike Tyson story you could tell? Like, what's your best Mike Tyson story?
Well, it's a lot of stories. It's a lot of stories dealing with Mike Tyson because he's so controversial. But one of my best experiences dealing with Mike is when I realized his skill level. You know, before I started working with him, a lot of people, a lot of other trainers, they made a comparison to like Mike Tyson and not Joe Lewis, but Mike Tyson and Joe Frazier. He fights like Joe Frazier and all this. But once I got with him, I realized his skill level, and I remember I was wrapping his hands one day, and he said something to me. Then I realized where his level come from. The skill level came from Customata. He told me that Customata told him that he could never beat Joe Lewis. And he said that Blackburn was the best trainer he ever lived. That's what Customata told Mike, and Mike told me that. So when he said that, then it come to me, okay, it's obvious that Cuss was a genius, because Mike's skill level basically is the same as Joe Lewis, but Customata took him and turned him around. He reversed him.
Yeah.
Once he reversed him, you can see he has the same skill level as a Joe Lewis and this type of thing. So that's one of the things that I just very, very intriguing about Mike, that I learned about him. Of course, my first fight with him, the McKinley fight, was very, very interesting for me. It actually changed me in boxing. It changed me, put me on a different level, and it changed everything. So things will never be the same because of him. I owe that to Mike Tyson, but he's just one of the greatest fighters ever lived.
All right, so there you have it. You know, Stacey McKinley giving you guys little insights just how great Mike Tyson was and what he saw in the gym while training him for that period of time of Mike's career. And mind you, when Stacey trained him, Mike was not even in his prime anymore. He was not mentally the same fighter. And I think that was the biggest thing for him. Had a Customado been in his quarter for a fight with George Foreman, I think it's a fight where maybe Cuss would have been in his ear and tried to protect Mike from George Foreman, but I think Mike would have been more up for it. He would have been more sharper. He would have been more disciplined. But it's almost like when Cuss died, you know, a big part of Mike also died. And George was a dangerous fighter. Like, I don't think people quite understand. Like, and even sometimes, like, I have to go back and watch George Foreman because a lot of people will just say that George was a big puncher, and that's all he was. But Mike saw that George was more than just a big puncher. Like, if you guys go watch the fight that him and Mike Tyson actually co-featured on the card together, I believe Mike fought Henry Tillman, and George Foreman fought Adelson Rodriguez. And Adelson Rodriguez, you know, for what it's worth, is probably the best Brazilian heavyweight, which I don't know what that counts for, but still, best Brazilian heavyweight, and he was a good fighter. You know, he had some good quality wins over Johnny Nelson. He had also worked his way up to the number 2 ranking spot in WBA or WBC. I can't remember which ranking body, but I know he was a highly ranked opponent. And then he got stopped by Holyfield, and then by the time he fought Foreman in 1990, he was ranked number 10. So Adelson Rodriguez was definitely a good opponent, and he was someone that wasn't there to lay down. And if you look at the way George fought him, George always had like really sound defense. Like he used to do weight training to make his forearms and his elbows and his arms really big so he could block and parry a lot of punches. And he was good parrying the punches with his gloves. You know, rolling the shots with his gloves. And he did that really, really well against Adelson Rodriguez. And his jab was very precise, and he used all that and was very economical. You know, George Foreman did not waste movement, and Mike knew that. Mike knew that if he fought George the way Evander Holyfield kind of did, might have been all sheer up, because at that point in time, you know, Mike defensively wasn't as tight as he was back in his earlier years, you know, when he was undisputed champion, the early part of the undisputed championship run. So, you know, he knew this. He knew that George was dangerous. In many ways, you know, George might have been just as dangerous now than as he was in his prime, because he was smarter. He had the ring experience, and at that point in time, he was finally match fit after having like 16, 17 fights. So, yeah, man, Mike was a great fighter, but I don't think he was mentally ready for that fight. Like, you look at just his career in general before the loss to Holmes. You know, this is when we talk Mike Tyson, we're talking about a man that when he gained the undisputed championship by beating Tony Tucker, you know, he defended it about 6 times before losing to Buster Douglas, and you know, he beat some good opponents. You know, Tony Tubbs, Michael Spinks, Frank Bruno. You know, so you know, he was a good fighter, man. Mike was definitely a good fighter, but it's like I said, man. You know, styles make the fights in boxing. Mike knew that that you know, George was a dangerous opponent for him, and you know, he was looking more towards. It's funny too, because if you guys go watch the fight with Adelson Rodriguez, they interview him and they ask him if he watched the George Foreman fight with George Foreman fought Adelson Rodriguez. So my bad. When Mike fought Henry Tillman, in the post-fight interview of that fight, they asked him if he watched George Foreman's fight with Adelson Rodriguez, which happened on the undercard of that particular fight, and Mike pretty much shrugged it off and was like, no, you know, gave a really politically correct answer. You know, I didn't watch him fight. I'm focused on Henry Tillman. But if you go watch the fight, you know, there's actually video of Mike Tyson getting his hands wrapped watching the fight. So he just was not interested in George Foreman, and he knew he was afraid of him. He was afraid of him. Mike was afraid of him to the point where he just, he had no confidence when Buster Douglas lost, and 2, he just didn't have cuss there, so I don't think he would be as mentally up for it. And you know, he was beating over masked opponents, and he wasn't the same defensively sharp fighter that he once was. So I think he knew that, and that's why you started seeing him look the way you started seeing him look in the direction of Evander Holyfield, a guy who was shorter, opens up a lot more, is a good fighter, but a great fighter, not a good fighter, a great fighter. But stylistically, you know, that's looked at to be easier matchup because of the fact that, you know, he's similar in size, not the one-punch artist that Foreman is, and his style is more suited for what Tyson does in the ring. So that's what it was. But Mike was still a great fighter. Speaking of Holyfield, in this next clip right here, you guys are going to see Holyfield give you guys a little bit of insight into what it was like to fight George Foreman, his punching power, what he brought in the ring, and I think it's some good stuff. I had a chance to talk to Holyfield earlier this year in January, so you guys watch this clip. Hope you enjoy it. Hope it gives you some insight to what George Foreman was in the ring when he fought Holyfield, because that was a big fight and a tough fight for Holyfield. When he fought George Foreman, he had to constantly be active and keep him at bay, just throwing combination after combination, and that's what he did. So hope you guys enjoy the clip. Here it is.
And man, when these guys do a shift and all of a sudden all them hands go up, and they don't knock you out, but them shots hurt. Like, that's how I know that they throw rocks. They throw rocks, and them rocks hurt. They start throwing about 6 or 7 seconds. You better have some moves. You better know how to get out of there and make them run into something. And so that's how I was able to beat George Foreman, because I realized he throw boulders, I throw rocks.
Yeah.
And if I hit him with all them rocks, you get hit right in the eye. You go pause just and get hit with something else. That's it. He tried to hit me with a big one. But you keep on throwing them little bit of punches, man, all of a sudden, you'll find out that they stop punching. Like I was telling people, I said, George and I said, George's good. I said, but I said, George on defense more than me than with anybody. I said, why? That's because I was throwing a lot of punches. You're going to get hit. So George do one of these numbers like this, and all he do is get close to you. He'll bump you, boom. Then I'm telling you, after that ball, that right hand get ready to hammer, He don't care where he hit you with this part, this, he coming like this. Woo. When it gets you up like this, get your body going back like this, and then he coming up.
Jab,
Wham!
Boom, that's
like
it.
This, like, so the whole big thing is that he pushed me so far back that every time he would miss me. He pushed me too hard. He pushed me too far out the way. Like this is
you wasn't but that big.
I'm like that was saying. I'm like that's like a boop. When he booped me, like this, and I just had good balance. But that's shot. Every time he hit me, he always missed me. Cause usually he hit you, and he don't care if he hits you on the shoulder, back, or anything. It's I'm like.
Alright, so there you have it from Evander Holyfield himself, the man himself. One of the greatest heavyweights who ever lived, man. Shouts out to Evander Holyfield for the great stuff we got earlier this year. But yeah, man, like, his fight with Foreman, you go back and you watch that fight, and he makes some great points, like, when he was throwing the I don't think I ever saw any opponent keep Foreman at bay as much as Holyfield. And the funny thing about that is, and this just goes to show you how great Foreman was, like, even though Holyfield was throwing all these sharp combinations, as he said, he was throwing rocks, you know, Foreman had boulders, you know, he could land, all he needed was one punch to hurt you. Like, he really had that one punch factor, probably more than any heavyweight who ever lived, where he could just really hurt you with one punch. And that was a fight where, you know, he's fighting a guy, Foreman at 42 years old was fighting a guy who was about, what, 14 years younger than him at the time. Foreman is 42, Holyfield is 28. This is actually, ironically, like, this is Evander Holyfield's first defense of his heavyweight title, which is funny because if you guys go back and watch the Riddick Bowe fights, they talked about the Riddick Bowe fights as like those are the fights where Evander Holyfield was trying to get respect as a heavyweight because, you know, he didn't get the Tyson fight when it was supposed to happen. So it's just funny now how, like, he didn't quite get the respect at the time for defending his titles against freaking George Foreman, which to me is just incredible the way he do it. And the funny thing is, like, Foreman hurt Holyfield a couple times, like quite a few times in that fight. He stunned Holyfield in rounds 2, 5, and 7, and it was a lot of back and forth action. So Foreman was a great fighter, a dangerous fighter, and I don't think Mike he didn't quite have the technical boxing skills that Holyfield had, and that's just what it was, man. And the confidence, I think the confidence too, like Holyfield, I think psychologically too, like Holyfield was hungrier at that point in time because this is a man that, yeah, he had achieved everything there was to achieve at cruiserweight, became undisputed there, moved up, and then when he finally beat Buster Douglas, he wasn't getting that respect because when Buster Douglas fought Holyfield, he made it look so easy. Then they made it say, oh, well, Buster Douglas was fat, he was this, he was that, so he didn't get the respect once he won the title. And then when he beat Foreman, who, by the way, was a very game opponent, you know, hurt him multiple times, you know, oh, it was an old man Foreman. So it wasn't until the first Riddick Bowe fight that Holyfield got any respect. As to where Tyson, on the other hand, you know, he had already been undisputed champion, the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history, youngest heavyweight undisputed champion in boxing history. Got upset by Buster Douglas. Then, you know, I think Kakas had already been dead years before that. And he was folding mentally outside the ring. His life was unraveling. You know, you had the I think the rape thing happened around that time. He was on his own going to prison not too long after that. So what I'm saying is, like, you know, Holyfield had more to prove than Tyson, and that definitely, like, your psychological, you know, your state of mind going into a lot of these fights is what plays a huge role in how fights play out. But George was a dangerous heavyweight because even after that Holyfield fight where he fought a prime Holyfield, undefeated Holyfield, a hungry Holyfield, a motivated Holyfield, you know, even after that he would still go on and he'd beat the likes of, you know, some good contenders, you know, beat the likes of Jimmy Ellis, beat the likes of Alex Stewart, you know, had lost a unanimous decision to Tommy Morrison, and then coming off that loss to Tommy Morrison, you know, he fights Michael Moore. Michael Moore, who, by the way, who I might add, Michael Moore at that time, Michael Moore had become the lineal heavyweight champion. A lot of people forget that. Moore was a 3-1 betting favorite. And you look at that fight, and Foreman was down on the cards. You know, Moore was dominating him, outboxing him, and he became the oldest boxer to ever win the heavyweight title. And I'm not talking about just a trinket or you know, just a regular belt. No. He was the lineal heavyweight champion, meaning that he was the man who beat the man. This man was a great fighter, and he was more than a big puncher. I kind of get like, after going back and watching his fights, like now it kind of bothers me when I hear people say that, like, that George was just a big puncher, that he was, no, he was more than a big puncher. He had a really good jab, a strong jab, accurate jab, a precise jab, an educated jab too. And defensively, like, he was, like I told you earlier, he's very much like Ken Norton. He had these thick, bulky, you know, forearms and biceps. So he would kind of put them together, kind of like Ken Norton, and he would, you know, he would block his chest and his midsection really well, and he was able to slip and roll a lot of shots, and that would frustrate fighters and get them scared, because then that would allow George to move forward and set up his big punches. So he was a dangerous fighter, a great fighter, and man, Mike Tyson would have had to really have fought his heart out for 12 rounds to beat him. So in conclusion, had Mike Tyson at 24 years old fought George Foreman at 42 years old in 1990, when the fight was when that was a possibility, when Don King was trying to make the fight happen, my overall assessment is I think Foreman would have beat him. I really do think Foreman would have beat him. And it really all starts off with the psychological part of boxing. You know, Mike had, like I said, Mike built his reputation much like we see a lot of fighters of today. Like, he built his reputation off fear, and these guys are mentally beat. A lot of these guys are mentally beat before they got in the ring with him. And once he didn't have that anymore, once he was kind of like, for lack of a better word, exposed, he wasn't as great as he was. He was still a great fighter, a dangerous fighter, but he wasn't as great. He wasn't looked at as great or as unbeatable as before he lost. And his confidence waned. Cus D'Amato not being there also played a big factor. And the fact that George Foreman at the time, you know, he was being written off, being laughed at, being slagged off by much of the boxing fans and media. You know, he had a lot to prove. And ultimately he wanted to prove it against Tyson, who at the time was not even just the biggest star in boxing. You could argue at the time he may have been the biggest star in all of sports. He was up there in the early 90s. He transcended the sport, and you know, George Foreman was literally the exact fighter who years earlier, when, if you guys go watch, when Mike and Cus D'Amato used to sit down and watch old fight films. There's one interview you guys go see when they're talking. Mike had to have been like 17, 16 years old, and they watch old fight films. You know, Mike was told by Cus that it was a bad style for him. And you know, if you just look at like the guys he lost to in his career, you look at like, okay, kind of the guys who could kind of box, who had good boxing skills. So Holyfield was a problem for him. Obviously, he wasn't in his prime, and you know, when that fight happened. Even when he fought Lennox Lewis later on, obviously he was not anywhere close to the fighter he was in the early in the late 80s, early 90s. But still, it's the same thing. You know, a bigger heavyweight with boxing skills. Now I know a lot of people will say like, oh, Mike didn't get to fight these guys when they were in their prime, but at the same time, man, like, he still got the fights, and there were times where these guys weren't in their prime either. Like, Holyfield wasn't in his prime when he fought Tyson, but Holyfield still beat him. So, you know, I just think, you know, with Foreman's ring experience, Foreman's hunger, Foreman's punching power, Foreman's ability to move forward and parry shots, I just see Mike Tyson breaking down in those mid to later rounds, and I see George Foreman just landing hard, clean, effective punches and getting Mike Tyson out of there. But it's a fight that, you know, I kind of wish would have happened. It's a fight boxing should have had, because like George fought in the Ali. George's prime was in the Ali era. Mike's hero was Ali. It would have kind of been cool to see Mike fight a guy from that era who actually had something left in the tank, because he did fight Larry Holmes, but Larry, he had retired from boxing. He was comfortable, he was fat, and Don King kind of just rolled up to his door and offered him millions to come out of retirement. So that I don't really count that, but it would have been great to see the fight. And not even just that, like it would have been cool to see Mike fight Riddick Bowe in his prime, because a lot of people, I remember when I said, I remember I made a video where I said Riddick Bowe could beat Tyson, and I interviewed Riddick Bowe about Tyson, and people thought Tyson would beat Bowe because and they were just slagging off Bowe, but I think Mike would have lost to Bowe too. So with that being said, it's something cool to think about. And you know, I hope I've given you guys some insight, and you guys have gained some insight if you haven't seen those clips before, of how great Mike was and how great George was. You know, hope that gave you some insight. And yeah, I would say if they fought at that time, I would go with a George Foreman 9th round technical knockout. That's what it is, man. Yeah, hope you guys like the video. To take time to subscribe. You know, like I always say in every video, you can love me or you can hate me, but I'm just a kid from Dania, and that's Dania in South Florida, if you didn't know. So yeah, like the video. Follow us on Instagram, True School Sports, and let me know any other boxing history videos, fights that didn't happen that you guys like to see me do in the future. I just felt like doing this one because just to match up that always fascinated me, that never happened, because it just made so much damn sense. They could have made so much money too, like what's his name? I think Foreman made $12.5 million when he fought Holyfield. So like, if he made $12.5 for fighting Holyfield, he would have definitely made like 20, 25, maybe 30 for fighting Tyson, because Tyson was just that huge as far as a sports star at that time. So would have probably been one of the highest grossing heavyweight fights in history. So that's what it is, guys. But take care, and I hope you guys enjoy the video.